There we go.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Suzanne Simpson. I'm the Land Stewardship Director with Bayou Land Conservancy. My background is in ecology and wildlife biology, and specifically, I did my master's research on an invasive anerin, which if you're not familiar with that word, you're about to be, called the Cuban tree frog, which is native to Cuba and the Caribbean and has established non-native invasive populations in Florida. So I have been a frog nerd almost my entire life. My dog is named Hyla, which if that name doesn't resonate with you, again, it will. I was either going to name my first child after a frog or my pet. So let's just all be grateful that I chose the dog. And today we are going to chat about some of the most common frog calls that you are going to hear in the Houston area. And without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen, Becky, and get the presentation going. Does that look good, Becky? Give me a thumbs up. Thank you, dude. All right. So I had a really hard time getting this presentation down to 15 frog calls, but that is what we are going to be listening to today. We're going to be listening to 15 of the most common frog calls that you're going to hear in the Houston area. And I really focused on the 8-county Houston area. I know Houston can be 14 or even more counties by some people's determination. But I wanted to focus on the ones that you're most likely to hear in your area. So let me change that. And just a note about the limitations of today's presentation. So first of all, this isn't going to be an exhaustive recital of every call you could potentially hear in the 8-county Houston area. And the recordings that you're going to hear are one call or one chorus at one place in one moment in time. So what you hear in the field could vary in pitch, frequency, or timbre. In general, warm and wet conditions are going to yield faster paced calls than cooler conditions. So this is going to be an introductory course to becoming a master of frog and toad calls. But the more that you listen to them and the more you listen to them in a variety of conditions, the better you're going to be at extracting the subtleties and the nuances of these different calls. First, let's go over some very basic frog and toad questions that you may have but are too embarrassed to ask. The difference between frogs and toads. To quote a famous herpetologist expert, there are swimmy ones and not so swimmy ones. And I can get more technical with you, but that is kind of it. In general, frogs have smooth skin, they have longer legs, they lay their eggs in a gelatinous ball. Toads have quote unquote warts, which are really tubercles. They have shorter legs, they lay their eggs in a long string of pearls. Frogs spend more time around water than toads do. Toads are a type of frog, so all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads, so it's kind of like squares and rectangles. And collectively, they're known as anerins. So that's the word you're going to hear me use a lot during this presentation, referring to both frogs and toads. I call them anerins. But some toads are frog-like, and some frogs are totally confusing. And so the solution is job security for herpetologists, taxonomists, and phylogenists so that we can dedicate our lives to the study of these awesome critters and figuring out what's a frog and what's a toad and everything else in between. Next question is, why do anerins call? So males will call to attract females and warn other males away from their mates. Females can call, but they almost never call. So almost every call you hear is almost certainly a male crooner. Some females will call out when they're about to mate to attract the male further, but almost everything that you hear outside your window is going to be a male frog calling for a mate or defending his territory. I also wanted to make a quick note about range maps. Whenever people are looking to see what frogs are in their area, they'll often consult county records or range maps, and I just want to note generally that many of them are inadequate or outdated. I would recommend using multiple resources to determine the presence or absence of a particular frog in your county. And I've listed some websites below that you can use as a resource to look at different range maps so that you are making sure that you're getting the best available data. Also, you'll hear this from me a lot during the presentation, herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians, that taxonomy changes a lot. And so some range maps may be referring to a frog or a toad when it was in a different species or part of a species complex. So I'm not trying to make your eyes glaze over, but I just want to make you aware that sometimes don't take every range map of a frog or toad's population as gospel. Okay, so actually I think what's going to be, let's see what's going to be easiest for me. We may end up actually leaving slideshow view and just, okay. So Becky, you can still see that screen, yeah?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we're gonna leave slideshow view because I need to be able to access another app here. I wanna start with probably the most requested frog call of any that I get. And that frog call is actually a toad, but it's a toad that's technically a frog. So again, here we are. This is the eastern narrowmouthed toad. And it's in the microhylid family, which is a very small family of, they're considered frogs, and they're only called a toad because they're terrestrial. But in spite of this, this frog's very small size, you can see in that photo that it fits very, very neatly into the palm of your hand. It has one of the most obnoxious calls of any anurin. So we're gonna start there. And audio is very important, so make sure you have your audio turned up for this call.
Eastern narrowmouthed toad, Gastrophryne carolinensis.
So hopefully you got the general idea from that sample. The eastern narrowmouthed toad sounds like a bleeding sheep out your window. It is incredibly loud, especially when you consider its size, and it also does well in urban and suburban areas. So it's something that you could still potentially hear in the city, or hear it if you're in a suburban area, because they adapt well to disturbance. So I'll play just a little bit more of that call for you before we move on to the next one. So if you were like trying to go to bed at around midnight and that thing started up out your window, it may be a long night for you. But it's definitely one of my very favorite calls. Next, so I am going to be starting, I want to say real quick, I'm going to be starting these calls not in any taxonomic order. I'm going to be starting them in the order of things that you're most likely to hear outside of your window where you're living. And then once we get past the first 8, which pretty much anyone could hear at any place in Houston, I'm going to get into the second half of the calls, which are ones that are a little bit more specialized. So this one, the Blanchard's cricket frog, is going to be present in vegetated ditches, wetland ponds. I don't hear them in the city unless I'm in a park area, but I do hear them in natural areas, even in the inner loop of Houston. So they are very adaptable. You can see that it is a frog, but it has tubercles. And the calls can definitely be heard here in Houston outside the established breeding season of May through July. So we tend to have a little bit longer breeding season, a longer call period for a lot of these anurins, and that's because of our warm, wet weather. We have really good conditions for amphibians down here, so they have more opportunity to mate. So I'm going to play the call for you. liken that call to being something like two marbles being clicked together, or two rocks being clicked together, and that's where you get the fun trick at the bottom of the slide. If you're with a school group and you hear cricket frogs calling, you can get the kiddos to start tapping some rocks together, and sometimes you can get the frogs to join a chorus. So cricket frogs, I'll play it just a little bit more of that call for you once more. And you can understand why it begets its name, because it does sound a little bit like a cricket.
Hey, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Is there a way to turn up the volume on that one? The first frog we could hear really well, but that one, not everyone can hear it.
My volume is at its max. I would make sure everybody's volume on their computer is at their maximum, but I can't make that one any louder. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, folks.
Hopefully that's a little bit better.
Eastern narrow.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So some of these calls are going to be a little bit quieter than others, and sometimes that's just indicative of the species. They just have a quieter call. All right, so moving on to a true toad, the Gulf Coast toad, Encilius nebulifera, is another one that can thrive in really urban environments. I live in the middle of a very concrete jungle, and after a summer rain, I absolutely hear Gulf Coast toads going nuts afterwards. So they're very adaptable to urban, suburban, and natural environments. They're quite ubiquitous throughout the Houston area. But I wanted to compare them to the Houston toad, because a lot of times when people see a toad in Houston, they think that they're seeing a Houston toad, which they can be forgiven for that, because that name rather does suggest that they are. But the Houston toad is an endangered species that lives now mostly in the Bastrop area and the extensions of those Central Texas ecosystems. They have not been reported in Houston proper since the 1960s. So if you hear a toad or you see a toad in your neighborhood in the 8-county area of Houston, it's not a Houston toad, it's a Gulf Coast toad. But I did want to just show the comparisons between those two individuals. You can see that the Houston toad has a lot of mottling on its belly. The Gulf Coast toad doesn't have as much. This picture, it's a little bit harder to see, but the Gulf Coast toad has some really extensive cranial ridging, and the Houston toad does not exemplify that. They also have much more mottling on the body. So I'm going to play you the call of a Gulf Coast toad, which is a call that I probably hear most often around my house. Here we go. So that call had more than one amphibian in it. You had a Gulf Coast toad that was chorusing next to an eastern narrowmouthed toad. So the trill that you're hearing is the Gulf Coast toad. So I'll play it for you one more time. We're going to listen to several species today where their call is a trill. And how you can tell a difference between these different trills that frogs and toads have is both the pitch and the length of the trill. So this trill, I would qualify it as a long, so long in duration, medium pitched trill. So you'll hear different trills today, and you can distinguish them that way. All right, Gulf Coast toad. Everything okay with that one, Becky?
Yep, everything's okay.
Super. Okay, moving on to our most common tree frog. Hyla cinerea is the green tree frog. If you're on this call and you are a little bit of a herpetologist nerd, you may know that there is now a subgenera that Hyla is considered. So if you see something called Dryophytes scenaria, or Dryophytes squirrella. That is what some of the New World tree frogs are being reclassified into it. But by the time I change all of my materials, it will be back to Hyla, so I am keeping it called Hyla for now. But Hyla scenaria is the green tree frog. Again, it's very adaptable to urban and suburban environments. You can see it almost everywhere in Houston. It does have a couple of lookalikes, and so we're going to go through some of the diagnostic characteristics other than their call that you can use to distinguish this frog. So you can see from the picture, it is a bright green color. It has these cream-colored dorsolateral stripes right through here. And some individuals also have these yellow specks right along here. And I'll tell you, if you see these yellow specks and you're trying to figure out what kind of a frog it is, you can pretty much stop at that point because no other frog in our area is going to exhibit that characteristic. But it can be distinguished from the squirrel tree frog, which is the next frog we're going to talk about, other than by its call, by this bold stripe down its side and these yellow flecks. So here is the call of the green tree frog, Hyla scenaria. So I kind of describe that as a rhythmic quanking sound. Sometimes it reminds me of a duck a little bit, but this is a frog that can also call at different pitches. Not too long ago, I was in the middle of an herbaceous wetland and I heard a frog call that I didn't immediately recognize. And, you know, I'm in the middle of this wetland having an existential crisis because I can't figure out what frog is calling. And I took a recording and I sat with it at my house and I realized that it was just a green tree frog that was calling at a slightly different pitch. So there is some variety in their call depending on environmental conditions, but I'll play it once more for you. All right, that's the green tree frog. Moving on to the squirrel tree frog, or Hyla squirrella. So same genus as the green tree frog, different species. And right away, you can see that the stripe down its lateral side is much more broken up than it is on the green tree frog. So that one is very clear, very bold. This one looks like someone started to draw a stripe on the frog and then they just kind of gave up midway down. It also doesn't exhibit any of these yellow flecks. Now, Hyla squirrella has a highly variable morphology, and the best way to identify this frog visually is by process of elimination. So knowing the other tree frogs that coexist with it, like the gray tree frog, which we'll go over, like the green tree frog, and saying, okay, it doesn't have this bold stripe, it doesn't have these yellow flecks, it doesn't have the tubercles like a gray tree frog, it must be Hyla squirrella, it must be a squirrel tree frog. So whenever these tree frogs are young, whenever they're neonates, they can be difficult to distinguish from other species of tree frog. It got its name because of the call, which can be likened to the sound of a territorial squirrel. So that's what we're going to listen to right now. So if you've ever had a squirrel that's kind of chattering at you from above a tree, or maybe chattering at your dog, that sounds a little bit like it, sounds a little bit familiar. And so that is how you can very easily distinguish audio-wise a squirrel tree frog from a green tree frog. Okay, moving on. Oh, that is the call of my own dog named Hyla. All right. So the bullfrog is perhaps the most recognizable call of any frog that we're going to talk about today. It is the largest frog in North America. It's native to Texas, but it is introduced to the western states and worldwide. And it's actually listed by the IUCN as one of the world's worst invasive species because Whenever it invades areas that it's not native to, it's able to prey upon native species, including native frogs. And it's also a disease vector of BD, which is also known as the chytrid fungus, which is a very, my dog is scratching herself, stop that, which is a very devastating fungus that began showing up in the amphibian world a few decades ago and has wound up causing huge devastations in amphibian populations worldwide. So let's listen to the call of the American bullfrog.
Oh, Suzanne, somehow, there, you were mute for a sec.
What, it did mute for a sec? Let me try that again. So right at the end of that call is where you heard the juggarum that people usually use to describe the American bullfrog call. That deep croak is what I hear most often. And something interesting about the bullfrog, so it's in the true frog family, and it displays sexual dimorphism. So you can tell a male from a female judging by the size of the tympanum. So this is the tympanum right here that I'm circling. And if the tympanum is larger than the eye, then it is a male. And if it's the same size as the eye, then it's a female. So in this case, pictured here, we would have a male American bullfrog. So we will listen to it one more time. There you go. Now we're going from very big frog to very tiny frog. This is the Rio Grande.
Sorry, I'm gonna interrupt for 1 sec. That's a perfect segue. We have a question. If you could say the approximate size of each of the species you're talking about.
Sure, yeah. The American bullfrog is the largest frog in North America, so it can get up to 6 to 8 inches. In converse, the squirrel tree frog is gonna max out at about 3 to 4 inches. Green tree frog is just a little bit larger at, about 3.5 to 5 inches. So the bullfrog is by far the largest frog that we have, that we've looked at thus far. Now the Rio Grande chirping frog, this is a frog that is about the size of the midpoint of your thumb to the end of your thumb. So a little bit larger than your thumbnail, but about the size of your thumb knuckle. And it is native to the Rio Grande Valley, but its distribution has extended to some of our urban centers. So Houston, San Antonio, Austin, there have been reports of it along LaGrange. And the reason that its distribution is extending is most likely because of the potted plant trade. And that's a common story with amphibians, where if things are non-native, or not in this case, but in other cases invasive, the potted plant trade often plays a role in that. So this is something that I also hear outside my window. They're very adapted to urban centers, and it can, well, I'll tell you what it can sound like, but first I want you to listen to it for yourself. And this one is quiet, so make sure that your audio's up. So in that call, you're hearing a lot of different bugs, but what that little light chirp in the background is the Rio Grande chirping frog. And I think that call recording is actually pretty interesting because it shows that the Rio Grande chirping frog's call isn't super loud most of the time. It usually is calling in about the same chorus as other bugs. So I'll play it for you one more time in case you couldn't pick it out the first time. So the Rio Grande chirping frog is also in the same genus, Eleutherodactylus, as another frog that is starting to make its way over to Houston called the greenhouse frog. And last summer, I found a greenhouse frog which looks extremely similar to the Rio Grande chirping frog. I found one in my garage, and I looked at it really closely, and I was like, I think that's a greenhouse frog. And the only reason I knew that is because greenhouse frogs are in Florida. And greenhouse frogs sound really, they look really similar to Rio Grande chirping frogs, and they sound kind of similar. I wasn't necessarily planning to play this call, but I think just because if anybody's hearing this outside their window, I would be interested to know. This is the call of the greenhouse frog, which is Eleutherodactylus planarostris. So that's really similar sounding to the Rio Grande chirping frog. But if you hear something that you think might be a greenhouse frog, I would be interested to know about it. So the Rio Grande chirping frog. Okay. The southern leopard frog, which is Rana sphenocephala, it is also sometimes known as Lithobates sphenocephala. Those that were in school before me learned it as Rana. I learned it as Lithobates, and now it seems that Rana is the preferred genus again because of some paraphyly in the phylogenetic tree. So depending on when you've learned about this frog, you may have learned a different scientific name. This frog is very, very common along wetland ponds, and you can tell it very easily in most cases because it has these spots that have this sort of greenish halo around them, and it has these really bold dorsolateral stripes. Now, this picture exemplifies those characteristics as well as you will see in the field. Sometimes these stripes aren't quite so bright, aren't quite so cream colored, but they should catch your eye. The frog in general is a very eye-catching frog between the spots and the stripes. Additionally, you can see right here, it has this little white spot on its this lighter spot inside its tympanum. It has this lighter color inside of it. So that's another diagnostic characteristic that, that can tell you that it's a southern leopard frog. And I am going to play a call not from my usual recording because I didn't like it very much. This is the call I want to play for you, the southern leopard frog. I think it sounds like running your finger along a balloon mixed with a little bit of like Woody the Woodpecker. So hopefully you were able to hear a bit of that. Southern leopard frogs are larger than any green tree frog. They're larger than tree frogs. They're smaller than a bullfrog. So they're kind of a medium-sized frog right in the middle of there. I'll play just a little bit more of its call while I let my very needy dog outside. One moment. So I liken that again to Woody the Woodpecker and running my finger along a balloon. Okay, in a very similar frog to the southern leopard frog, same size, so a medium-sized frog, is the green frog, or also known as the bronze frog. So this is Rana clamitans. It used to be a subspecies of Rana clamitans, but it seems like that subspecies has been synonymized, and so now we just have a genus and a species to worry about. Again, frog taxonomy changes all the time. It can be distinguished from the leopard frog by its lack of dorsal spots. So you see it doesn't have those leopardy spots on its back, and its dorsolateral ridges are much, much darker. Additionally, it has this dark spot on its tympanum rather than the light spot of the southern leopard frog. And this one is one of my absolute favorite calls. It sounds like a loose banjo string being plucked. So let me dial that one up for you. So in that recording, you're hearing a bronze frog chorusing with a green tree frog. I'm gonna play it for you again to make sure you can pick out the banjo string. So those little notes are the bronze tree frog. Excuse me, the bronze tree frog, the green frog or bronze frog. Speaking of tree frogs, we have the eastern and Cope's gray tree frog to discuss. So this tree frog is about the same size as both the green tree frog and the squirrel tree frog. And the reason that I put two of these species together is because both of them form a species complex. Neither of them is reliably distinguishable from the other visually. The biggest difference, at least genetically, is that Hyla versicolor, which is known as the eastern tree frog, has twice as many chromosomes as Hyla chrysosceles. And as far as we know, only Hyla versicolor is present in Harris County. Now, these two can be distinguished between each other from their call. And so we're gonna play both of them for you so you can hear the differences in their call. But in areas where they are sympatric, meaning that they occur at the same geographic area, you can hear both of them calling at the same time. It is possible that one can sort of start to sound like the other, and that can make it a little bit confusing. But usually, based on environmental conditions, they're able to distinguish their call between each other, and you can tell the difference between Hyla versicolor and Hyla chrysosceles. So the first thing I'm going to play for you, whichever one comes up first on here, I will play Hyla versicolor, which is the eastern gray tree frog. This is Hyla versicolor. So you hear it's that short, kind of high-pitched trill. We talked about the trills that we heard from our toads earlier. Those were much longer, louder, and deeper pitched. This is a higher pitched, short in length trill. And then I will play Hyla chrysosceles, which is right here. So the length of the trill is similar, but Hyla chrysosceles has a much deeper pitched trill than Hyla versicolor. So that's the best way to distinguish the two in areas where they co-occur. This species is sort of the whole reason that I talked about why range maps aren't always accurate, because for a long time, everyone thought that these were the same frogs because they're indistinguishable and they just call a little bit different. But it wasn't until we had the ability to analyze their karyotype that we noticed that Hyla versicolor has twice as many chromosomes, and these species aren't interbreeding and they are distinct species, and we actually have a species complex on our hand rather than one individual species. So practically all of the original records of the gray tree frog are treating these individual species as the same species. So a lot of these range maps are having to be reworked because there are areas where they co-occur, but there are areas where they don't, where they're very distinct. And so far, it appears that Hyla versicolor is on the East Texas coast, where we are in Houston, and Hyla chrysosceles hasn't been found in that area yet. So this is one of my favorite sort of species conundrums within our local tree frogs, because we have a diploid tetraploid species complex, which is pretty cool. And it's a reminder to us as naturalists and as nature enthusiasts that evolution is happening with us. We are living in as dynamic a time as there has ever been on Earth. And so what we're seeing isn't a snapshot of something that's completed. We're seeing speciation actually happen live in front of us. And the great tree frog complex is a perfect example of that kind of speciation happening right before our eyes. It's thought that this speciation probably started around the Ice Age, and it's taken us to where we are now. Okay, I'm gonna start talking about a group of tree frogs called the chorus frogs. So we finished all of the frogs that are the most common to hear in urban environments. Now we're gonna get to frogs that might be a little bit more specialized, or they may have a shorter calling period, or they may be really sensitive to disturbance, and so they prefer undisturbed environments. The one that I'm starting with is probably the most adaptable to our environment, and that is the spring peeper, which is known as Pseudacris crucifer. And it's called crucifer because of this dorsal cross pattern that you can see right here. This picture is as good of a cross pattern as you're ever going to see. Sometimes it doesn't connect all the way on its back. Sometimes it's a little bit more mottled, but you should be able to make out more or less a cross pattern on a spring peeper's body. This is the first frog call that I hear almost year in and year out. This year, the first frog call that I heard was a spring peeper on January 25th. So for us in the southeastern United States, it's more like a midwinter peeper than a spring peeper. We start to get their calls a little bit earlier. Also, the next time that you are watching TV, especially if you're someone that watches Ozark, I invite you to listen to the frog calls in the background. The spring peeper is a celebrity frog that makes an appearance on many, many TV shows as the frog call of choice in their background. So you will definitely pick it up if you watch Netflix. And I'm going to play for you now the call of the spring peeper. So you hear that kind of high-pitched peep. It is very easy to distinguish, and you'll hear it in Texas around the beginning of the year. Our next chorus frog, oh, and let me mention the size. Chorus frogs tend to be smaller than tree frogs. So we're looking at a frog that's more of maybe 2 to 3 inches maximum size. So smaller than tree frogs, but larger than an eastern narrow-mouthed toad, which is a microhylid, which is a very small frog. Okay, the Cajun chorus frog is our most recently described species on this list, if I'm not mistaken. It was described in 2008 and described from a lab that works out of Florida. It can be distinguished from Pseudacris crucifer, the spring peeper, by the lack of that dorsal X on the back. You can see we have some bold vertical stripes here. Not all of their stripes will always be so bold. And they certainly have a distinct call. So let's get into the call of the Cajun chorus frog. That's a really quiet one. If you can't hear it well, it kind of sounds like when you're running your fingers along a comb. It's this ascending click pattern. I'll play it one more time. There you go. So that's the Cajun chorus frog. Next, we have the spotted chorus frog, and you can tell that this picture was not taken in Houston by the ground. It's not present in the easternmost portion of the state, but we do have it here in Harris County and in Waller County, in the counties that are a little bit further west of us. Of all the frog calls on this list, I kind of consider this one to be the classic frog call. Whenever somebody thinks of a frog call, I feel like they're thinking about the call of a spotted chorus frog. So if you hear that in your backyard, you know you don't have a sheep, you know you don't have a banjo string, you definitely have a frog. I'll play it a little more for you. And that is the spotted chorus frog call, Pseudacris clarki. Next, we have Strecker's chorus frog. So the difference morphologically between this and the others is this is our largest chorus frog. So unlike these other frogs that we've just taken a look at, the Strecker's chorus frog is a little bit more toad-like, and you can kind of see it in its body shape right here, that it's a little bit more rotund, a little bit more of what you think about when you think about a toad. It also has this dark stripe right here through its eye, and it has this dark spot under the eye. So those are two diagnostic characteristics that you can use to identify this as a Strecker's chorus frog. And even though it's a beefier frog, it has kind of a delicate trill. So let's listen to it. So to me, it kind of sounds like when somebody is, you know, calling at you from far away, but they sort of give up. And hey, so it's sort of this this sort of tentative, higher pitched, short trill. All right, we are going, our last frog call, number 15, is the crawfish frog. So this is another frog that is in the true frog family. So it's a rana or a Lithobates areolata. And it is a species of greatest conservation need in Texas. Unlike a lot of these other frogs that we've talked about, they really are more of a habitat specialist, and they prefer wet prairie habitats, like our prairie potholes that we have on the southeastern part of Houston and in areas still remaining in Harris County. Their presence or absence in both Harris and Chambers and adjoining counties are being studied by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So there are properties where acoustic monitoring is being set up to see if there is a crawfish frog calling in that area, so we can have a better idea of where this frog occurs and where it doesn't. We have good evidence that its population has decreased over time because of rampant habitat loss, but we want to know what the state of this population is. The IUCN considers this a near threatened species, so that you can have least concern, near threatened, threatened, and we are at near threatened right now. But that's going to be dependent on what kind of data we're able to collect on the presence of this frog. So here is the call of the crawfish frog. Not the airplane. So it has sort of that rubbery sound that the other rana species have, like the southern leopard frog. But for some reason, this one makes me feel like I'm about to hear someone about to get sick. Like, I don't know why that is what it resonates with me, but yeah. So if you hear this around a natural area, that would be a really interesting observation that you would want to make sure to pass on to the wildlife biologists at Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, because they are invested in making sure that this frog is able to sustain its population. And I want to mention that anurans need your backyard. Your backyard is going to provide critical habitat for species. We have experienced so much habitat fragmentation in the Houston area that an easy thing that you can do to ensure that we have healthy populations of anurans is create a home for frogs and toads on your property. And you can do that by having a water source and then making a PVC pipe tree frog home like you see in these pictures. So what you can do is use a 3/4 inch in diameter PVC pipe. Make sure it's the thinner piping, not the really thick piping. And if you hammer it near a water source, you have just created a home for tree frogs. Whenever I was doing my field work studying the Cuban tree frog, I got almost all of my collections from these PVC pipes. If you set them up near a water source, they will come hang out in them. They're warm whenever it's cold, and they are cooler whenever it's blasted hot. They're able to retain some moisture, but they don't get flooded. Make sure that you poke a hole in the PVC pipe so it doesn't flood. And it's a really great addition to your backyard, so you can get some amphibians in your life. And then you can start identifying by their calls after this webinar. So I'll end with, first of all, thanking you guys so much. This is our first BLC Live that's had a really solid audio component. So thank you for hanging with me as we figured out the technical part of this presentation. BLC Live is a free webinar series that we are bringing to help us all stay connected during the global pandemic. So I hope you'll consider supporting the work of your local land trust. And I'm happy to take questions if we have a sufficient amount of time, Becky.
Yeah, we do. We do have some time, and we had a couple questions come in, Suzanne. The first one was from Mohammed, who was asking, do frogs have a call when they sense danger?
Yes, the frog that you will hear this most commonly with is our good friend, the southern leopard frog. Let me get that one back up here. Here we go. Whenever you're walking around an area and you hear this sound that's sort of like a, ah! It's almost like you've surprised the frog, and the frog is like, ah! And then it jumps into the water. Yeah, that's a common defense mechanism in southern leopard frogs. And you'll also hear it in bullfrogs. So the true frogs do have sort of a frightened call whenever they want you to stay away. In fact, I will say there are some circumstances where I never would have seen the frog if I hadn't heard them like give me that little squeaky call that they were right there for me.
That's pretty funny. Okay, we've got another question from Elise, who is asking if you would talk about the health of frogs and toads, the health of their populations.
Yeah. So I'll speak specifically about the southeastern United States. Amphibian populations in general are on the decline, certainly internationally. A big part of that is the loss of habitat, and as well as pollutants and runoff that are affecting the health of our amphibian populations. Amphibians are known as our canaries in the coal mine. So if a frog starts getting 2 heads or 5 legs, we know that something is wrong in the water because they are extremely sensitive. They're breathing through their skin. They're able to exchange nutrients through their skin. And so they're going to be picking up the pollutants that we have in our water. So that is one of the first things that we look to as water quality experts. Is how are the amphibians responding to this water quality? I do also want to mention, I don't know if we have a question about chytrid, Becky, do we?
No.
Okay, well then I'm going to talk about it. Chytrid is the fungus that I referenced earlier that's devastated amphibian populations internationally, but it hasn't devastated all amphibian populations internationally. And in fact, chytrid is fairly ubiquitous here in the southeastern United States in amphibian populations. And by the way, when I say amphibians, I'm also including salamanders in that. But our populations thus far have not seen a decline because of the chytrid fungus. And in fact, for a while, it was posited that perhaps chytrid is endemic to the southeastern United States since our frogs are less vulnerable to them, but that hasn't really played out in the research. So that doesn't mean that we're in the clear as far as chytrid goes. If we've learned anything over the past few months, it's that emerging diseases or diseases that evolve can really change the scope of your life. And the same is true for amphibians. But as of right now, the chytrid fungus has not been a significant threat to amphibian populations in the southeastern United States. Western United States, different story.
Good to know. I think we're all learning that lesson. There were 2 questions about the details on the PVC pipe. If you could repeat those details. And
Sure.
Alyssa asked specifically, do the poles have to be in water, or could they be in the ground near a pond?
They can be in the ground near a pond. The size of PVC piping that I recommend is the 3/4 inch diameter. And I also recommend the piping that is thinner rather than thicker. Usually you have the option to get those really thick PVC pipes. Opt for the thinner ones. They have more room to be a frog in there. And you can, you can put them near the water. It doesn't need to be in the water. And make sure you poke a hole at the bottom so that the pipe can drain.
How long should the pipe be? Like how tall up?
About 3 feet. So about to your hip height. Yeah.
All right. Cool. I
guess
have a
that's
feeling
what
some
it
folks
is.
are going to be doing this.
Yeah, I'm glad.
Steve asked if there's a frog app, kind of like the bird apps that are out there that can help you identify the calls or identify the trills.
Well, the best one out there is iNaturalist, to be honest. I'm not sure if he's saying like an app that has the call, is like if you're looking for one that has the calls loaded on them that you can listen to, then I do have an app on here.
Yeah, he'd like to be able to provide playback of their calls.
Mm-hmm. So there used to be a Reptiles of Texas app or a Herps of Texas app. I'm not sure if it's still in existence. I think it may have like stopped getting supported technically. What I have done, and I mean maybe this speaks to my level of nerddom, is you can download frog calls from the internet really easily, and I just have created my own iTunes playlist and I created my own Spotify playlist of the frog calls that we have in this area. So today I played 15 for you, but I have about 23 in my playlist. I don't know if I can distribute it because I downloaded them all from the internet. I didn't take any of them, but they were all for free from the internet. So you can also do that. Make your own playlist. If the pirates come after me because of frog calls, we don't have enough work.
Let's see. We've got another question from a Jamie who's asking, are green tree frogs able to change colors to gray?
No, squirrel tree frogs can exhibit some change in coloration. Green tree frogs have consistent coloration. So if you're seeing a frog that's changing colors, that's a good indication that you might have a squirrel tree frog.
And then I think there was one last question from Mohammed. Are any of these frogs or toads poisonous?
Okay, good question. So the only toad that has any type of a poison on it is the Gulf Coast toad can secrete a sort of a caustic substance out of its glands that you see right here. And so if your dog were to eat a Gulf Coast toad whole, it might secrete that, and then your dog throws up the toad because it doesn't taste good. We don't have any frogs that are poisonous in the sense of like poison dart frogs. The only reason that poison dart frogs are poisonous is because they eat a specific type of ant in the rainforest that they are able to sequester that toxin and put it in their skin and become poisonous. So if you raise a poison dart frog in captivity, it's not poisonous anymore. So it's getting its poison from its external environment. None of our frogs have that.
Okay, that's good to know. We've got a lot of questions coming in, everybody. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of them. I want to respect everyone's time. We're just a minute shy of 4 o'clock.
I'm happy to hang around if people want to keep asking questions.
Okay, so
and people can just get off if they want to get off.
sounds good. Let's see. The next question, Lynn was asking for the PVC pipe. Where do you put the hole in the pipe? Will you repeat that one more time?
Put it towards the bottom, about a third of the way up the pipe, so that the water can drain whenever it gets when it starts to get full.
Okay. Let's see. Margaret asks, or she says, a toad laid eggs in my small backyard pond, and a lot of tadpoles resulted, but no toads. What happened?
Yeah. So on the one hand, and then on the other hand, so it's tough to say exactly why they didn't metamorph. It could be that they were preyed upon. It could be that the water wasn't conducive to them to live. Toads and frogs lay a lot of eggs, and a very, very small percentage become successful adults. So it's tough to say exactly what happened to that particular clutch. But I would say rest easy that the toad is going to be able to breed again. We have a pretty long breeding season.
Let's see. Susan Martin asks, can you discuss the frog-toad activity throughout the day? What are they doing during the day?
Oh, okay. So whenever we get into our really hot summer months, some species will do something called estivate. So that's AESTIVATE, estivate. And that means that basically they hunker down, find a cool, wet spot, and chill there as much as they can during the day. Now, during the cooler months, they can have some day activity if they're moving around, if they're moving to a different territory. But for the most part, the species that we've talked about today are crepuscular, which means they're going to be most active during the twilight hours. So dawn and dusk is when you're going to see most of these guys moving around. That's their party time. During the day, they're kind of trying to lay low because that's when the birds are going to come out and get them.
Let me see if we have any more questions. I'm sorry. Let's see. There are some notes here that somebody has written to everyone about iNaturalist. So just if you guys are still looking for calls or where to find them, check out these notes in the chat. I don't know who Mom's iPad is to give them the recognition. But let's see, we've got a question here from David Knock. He is asking, do all Anurans have a tympanum? And there was a question earlier about what is a tympanum. So I tried to describe in the chat, but Suzanne, if you want to point that out, that would be probably more helpful.
The tympanums are going to be most predominant in the true frogs that we talked about. So our bullfrogs, our Rana genus. Other frogs do have tympanums that are less pronounced, and tympanums are really what are helping the frog feel the vibrations of their external environment. Is that what you found, Becky, or am I making something up?
Yeah, I mean, I basically said it's like their ear.
Yeah, there you go. It's their tympanic membrane, it's their eardrum, it's what's helping them interact with their environment, and that's really their main source of doing so. I couldn't go so far as to say whether all frogs do or don't have a tympanum, but certainly the true frogs do, and they're very pronounced.
I hope, let's see, I think that answers everyone's questions for now. You guys, if you have more questions, we'd love to see you throughout the week. Suzanne, every Thursday at 3 o'clock, does a Facebook Live on Ask an Ecologist. And so you can send her questions throughout the week. You can even post them on that chat. She may not be able to answer them completely, at that exact moment. You may need to do some research, but join us Thursdays at 3 o'clock, Facebook Live for Ask an Ecologist. And you can stump her with all sorts of crazy questions. Let's see. And, I got a couple more questions.
While you're reading those questions, I'll mention that we're going to put this recording on Bayou Land Conservancy's YouTube channel. So you can share it with a friend who wants to learn more about frogs and toads, which should be all your friends. Share it with all your friends.
I think that answers. And then there was also a question about your contact for questions. And so Jill has helpfully written that down in the chat for everyone. If you submit questions to info@bayouland.org, we will get them to Suzanne. Thank you everyone so much for joining today, and be sure to send your questions.
Good to talk to y'all.
Have a wonderful afternoon.